I need to see your papers. Are you a U.S. citizen?
Yep, born in Chicago.
What's this about? I'm asking a simple legal question. What's my violation? What have I done wrong?
Just show me the goddamn papers.
George Rivers never imagined he'd have to prove his American citizenship at 72 years old, standing outside a Veterans Affairs clinic in Minnesota where he'd just collected his medication. He'd survived 2 grueling tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, carried classified secrets that saved lives he couldn't speak about, returned to a post-9/11 America that viewed him with suspicion rather than gratitude, and built a quiet existence despite invisible wounds. Now, 2 Homeland Security investigations agents, responding to what would later be exposed as a racially motivated anonymous tip, were demanding papers from a decorated Special Forces veteran in a sun-drenched parking lot. The surveillance cameras captured every second of the confrontation that would reveal how easily federal authority could be weaponized against those who had sacrificed everything in silence. This is the story of how one man's hidden valor, finally brought to light, would result in a $33.5 million reckoning. If you are ready to see institutional racism taken down, like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss tomorrow's story of cops messing with the wrong people and finding out. Let's continue. George Rivers' life had been shaped by sacrifice and silence. Born on the south side of Chicago in 1948, he'd grown up during the civil rights movement's most turbulent years. The youngest of 4 children raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry and a father who drove a bus for the Chicago Transit Authority. He'd watched his city burn after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, seen neighborhoods fracture along racial lines, witnessed his older brother beaten by police during a protest he wasn't even part of. His cousin had been drafted to Vietnam and came back in a flag-draped coffin. His sister had married young to escape the cramped apartment where 6 people shared 3 rooms. When George turned 18 in 1966, his options were limited. College required money his family didn't have. Factory jobs were disappearing. The streets offered temptation he refused to accept. The military presented a way forward, and despite his mother's prayers and his father's warnings about how the Army treated black soldiers, George enlisted. He'd been assigned to basic training at Fort Benning, then advanced infantry training, then selected for specialized units based on aptitude tests that surprised even him. By 1968, he was deployed to Vietnam, arriving just as the war reached its peak of violence and futility. His first tour lasted 13 months. Patrol routes through triple canopy jungle where visibility ended at arm's length, ambushes that erupted without warning, friends who vanished in firefights or were carried out on stretchers. He'd learned to move through hostile territory like a shadow, to trust instincts over orders when survival demanded it. He'd come home in 1969 to a Chicago that didn't know what to do with him, where anti-war sentiment ran high and veteran status earned suspicion rather than respect. For a young black man from the South Side, it was isolation layered on isolation. He'd returned to service within months, not from patriotism but because civilian life felt more foreign than combat zones. His second tour took him deeper into covert operations, missions that existed only in classified files, but the wars that defined his later service came decades afterward. When the towers fell in 2001, George was 53 years old, working security at a Minneapolis office building, living a quiet life with a wife and grandchildren. He could have stayed home. Instead, he contacted old military connections and volunteered for private contract work that led back into government operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. His 2 tours in those theaters were nothing like Vietnam. The enemy was different. The rules were murkier. He operated in special forces units despite his age, his experience making him valuable for classified missions that required judgment earned through decades, not training manuals. He participated in an operation in southern Afghanistan that extracted a group of aid workers and local interpreters from Taliban territory, a mission that remained sealed in classified files. He'd taken shrapnel to his leg during the extraction, earned commendations he accepted without ceremony, and declined public recognition to keep operational details secure. The scars on his face came from an IED blast that killed 2 men beside him. The limp in his gait was permanent damage from that shrapnel wound that never fully healed. He'd come home in 2007, 59 years old and feeling ancient. He'd buried his wife 3 years later, built a modest life in Minnesota near his son and grandchildren. attended VA appointments for injuries that refused to fade and trauma that surfaced in quiet moments. He rarely spoke about his service, especially the classified operations. The Silver Star sat in a drawer. The sacrifices remained private. On a bright morning in late May 2023, George Rivers walked out of the VA clinic in a suburban Minneapolis strip mall, his left leg dragging slightly, his medication bag clutched in his right hand. The parking lot was busy with morning traffic, cars pulling in and out, civilians going about ordinary routines. The sun was warm against skin marked by decades of exposure to harsher elements. He was 72 years old and tired in ways that had nothing to do with the morning hour. Two men in dark jackets approached from a parked sedan. Federal agents. He recognized immediately the bearing, the purposeful stride, the badges already visible. The lead agent was younger, maybe 40, with the rigid posture of someone who'd never questioned authority. His partner hung back slightly, hand resting near his belt. The demand came without preamble. Papers. Citizenship documentation. An anonymous tip had identified him as potentially illegal, someone who looked foreign, someone whose rough appearance suggested he didn't belong. The words carried weight meant to intimidate, authority backed by federal power. George stood still, his scarred face expressionless, his limp leg aching from standing too long in the clinic. He stated his citizenship calmly. Chicago, 1948. Military service, 2 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. But even as he spoke, he recognized the futility. These men had already decided what they saw. He reached into his wallet with deliberate slowness, producing his military ID, his VA card, his Minnesota driver's license. Each document was state-issued, federally recognized, proof of identity and service. The lead agent barely glanced at them. Insufficient. They needed a birth certificate, a passport, something beyond what any reasonable person carried to a medical appointment. Bystanders began to notice. A woman with grocery bags paused near her car. An elderly man in a veteran's cap stopped walking. Phones emerged, cameras activating. The surveillance system mounted above the clinic entrance captured every moment from a fixed angle that would later prove crucial. George's frustration built slowly, controlled but visible. He'd given years to this country in ways these agents would never understand, carried secrets that protected operations they'd never know existed, bore scars from service they couldn't comprehend. And now he stood in a parking lot being treated like a criminal based on an anonymous complaint about his appearance. The agents stepped closer, their voices hardening. They needed him to come with them for verification. Standard procedure, just routine. The words were meant to sound reasonable, but the underlying message was clear: compliance wasn't optional. George pulled back instinctively when the lead agent reached for his arm. Not aggressive, just reflexive. The response of someone who'd spent years in situations where being grabbed meant danger. His medication bag fell, pills scattering across asphalt. His ID slipped from his hand, plastic and paper spreading across the ground. The agents moved faster then, hands on him, firm grips, voices commanding compliance. The crowd of bystanders grew, more phones appeared. Someone shouted that he was a veteran, pointing at the emblems on his jacket. Another voice called the agent's actions illegal. The scene escalated from confrontation to spectacle. George didn't resist physically, but his voice cut through the noise. Decades of service reduced to this moment, his body marked by sacrifice, being judged as foreign, his citizenship questioned in the country he'd bled for in silence. The words came raw, unfiltered, captured by a dozen cameras and the clinic's surveillance system. The handcuffs locked around his wrists with mechanical precision. The agents guided him toward their vehicle, procedure executed without regard for the crowd's protests or the phones recording everything. George walked with his damaged leg dragging, his scarred face set in an expression that mixed disbelief with resignation. As he was placed in the back seat, his mind raced through fragments of memory. The classified operation in Afghanistan, where he'd held together an extraction under fire. The commendation ceremony he'd declined to protect mission security. The quiet decades of carrying secrets while building an ordinary life. And now this detained in a strip mall parking lot, treated like a threat by the nation he'd served in shadows. The vehicle pulled away from the clinic, leaving behind scattered medication, dropped identification, and a crowd of witnesses whose footage would soon ignite something far larger than a routine detention. George sat in silence, hands cuffed, watching Minnesota suburbs pass through tinted windows, and wondered how service could be so thoroughly invisible until it became inconvenient. The drive to the HSI field office lasted 23 minutes through Minneapolis traffic, George Rivers silent in the back seat, separated from the agents by a metal partition that reduced them to silhouettes. His wrists ached where the handcuffs pressed against bone, metal cold despite the warm afternoon. He focused on breathing, on keeping his mind from spiraling into the familiar patterns of combat stress that still surfaced after all these years. His thoughts drifted to missions that existed only in sealed files. The extraction operation in Helmand Province, where he'd coordinated the rescue of 14 civilians and 3 intelligence assets from a compound surrounded by hostile forces. The night he declined a ceremony that would have made him visible, choosing instead to keep operational details secure, to remain a ghost in the system. He'd understood even then that recognition came with exposure, and exposure endangered future missions. So he'd accepted commendations privately, filed away medals, and returned to work that required anonymity. Now that anonymity had become invisibility. The very scars earned in classified service had marked him as foreign in his own country. The field office occupied 3 floors of a nondescript building near downtown, government bland in its architecture and purpose. The agents escorted him through a rear entrance, past security checkpoints, into processing rooms that smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. They removed the handcuffs and directed him to a metal chair bolted to concrete flooring. Processing began with mechanical efficiency. Fingerprints rolled across digital scanners. Photographs taken from multiple angles. His scarred face captured in harsh fluorescent lighting. Personal belongings inventoried and sealed in plastic, wallet, keys, the medication he'd never retrieved from the parking lot. A phone that had been buzzing with calls he couldn't answer. Each step was procedure, impersonal, the treatment any detainee received regardless of circumstance or history. George sat motionless through it all, his military training asserting itself in ways that felt both familiar and bitter. He'd been processed before, entering service, deploying overseas, returning through checkpoints. But this was different. This was being treated as suspect in the nation he'd served for decades, his citizenship questioned because anonymous bias had been given federal authority. A younger agent, different from the 2 who detained him, typed information into a database with the bored efficiency of someone executing routine tasks. The queries ran quickly. Birth records from Cook County, Illinois. Social Security verification. Military service records that should have been immediately accessible to federal systems. The confirmation took less than 3 minutes. George Rivers, born Chicago, Illinois, January 15th, 1948, United States citizen. Honorable discharge after multiple deployments. Commendations including Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Current address, Minnesota, valid driver's license, no criminal record, VA patient in good standing. The screen displayed a service history that should have prevented this entire encounter. The agent stared at the monitor for several seconds before standing and leaving the room without comment. George sat alone, hands resting on the metal table, his reflection distorted in the 2-way mirror across from him. Minutes passed. Then more agents entered, including a supervisor whose expression suggested damage control calculations were already underway. George's voice was steady when he spoke. He wanted the anonymous complaint. Full disclosure of what had triggered this detention, who had filed it, what exactly had been reported. The request wasn't negotiable. The complaint surfaced 20 minutes later, printed on standard federal forms. Anonymous tip phoned in to HSI hotline earlier that morning. Subject described as foreign-looking male, rough appearance, visible facial scarring, unusual gait suggesting recent border crossing. Location provided matched the VA clinic. No specific allegations beyond appearance-based suspicion. The caller hadn't left contact information. The words transformed the incident from bureaucratic error into documented bias. George's scars, earned in classified operations defending national interests, had been weaponized against him. His limp, permanent damage from shrapnel taken during a mission that saved lives, had been interpreted as evidence of illegal status. The anonymous system designed to protect national security had instead enabled racial profiling of a decorated veteran. The supervisor offered release with rehearsed apologies that carried no weight. Standard procedure, routine verification, no intent to cause distress. The words were hollow, legal hedging designed to minimize liability while acknowledging nothing. George walked out of the field office as the sun angled toward evening, 6 hours after being detained in a parking lot. His granddaughter waited near the entrance, her expression mixing relief and fury in equal measure. Kiana had driven from her downtown law office the moment she'd seen the bystander videos going viral on social media, her civil rights practice immediately recognizing the implications. George broke when he saw her, the controlled composure maintained through hours of processing finally cracking. Not tears, but something deeper, the weight of being reduced to suspect status after decades of invisible service, the humiliation of proving citizenship in the country he'd defended in silence. Kiana held him in the parking lot while he shook, her legal mind already assembling the framework for justice. The immediate aftermath unfolded rapidly. The bystander videos had spread across social platforms within hours of the detention, viewed millions of times, shared by veterans organizations, civil rights groups, local news outlets. The footage showed everything: the initial confrontation, George's calm presentation of identification, the agent's dismissive rejection, the moment his medication scattered across asphalt, the handcuffs, the crowd's protests. Each frame documented the conversion of service into suspicion. Kiana's apartment became a war room. Evidence assembled across her dining table, surveillance footage from the clinic obtained through public records requests, body camera files from the agents secured through legal demands, witness statements from bystanders who'd recorded the encounter, medical records documenting George's service-related injuries, VA documentation of his treatment history. Each piece built a narrative of systematic failure and racial bias weaponized through federal authority. George struggled through the days following release, sleep fractured by memories mixing past combat with recent humiliation. The detention had triggered responses he'd managed for years: hypervigilance, distrust, the constant calculation of threats. He attended a scheduled VA appointment and found himself scanning for agents, checking identification multiple times, unable to shake the fear of being questioned again. The community response intensified. Local veterans groups organized solidarity gatherings, civil rights organizations issued statements condemning the detention, media requests flooded Kiana's office. The story resonated beyond Minneapolis, touching national conversations about immigration enforcement, racial profiling, treatment of veterans, the weaponization of anonymous tips against marginalized citizens. Should federal agents have the power to detain citizens based on unverified anonymous tips? The question cut through political divisions, forcing examination of systems that enabled bias to operate under legal authority. Share this story if you believe veterans deserve better, or comment below with why such biases must be challenged to protect our heroes. The lawsuit's discovery phase began 3 months after the detention, Kiana leading a legal team that included veteran civil rights attorneys and former military advocates. Standard document requests revealed department policies, training materials, statistics on detention demographics. But deeper investigation uncovered something that transformed the case entirely. Buried in George's classified service records, accessible only through security-cleared review and federal court orders, was documentation of the Helmand Province operation. The mission had extracted not just random civilians but high-value assets, including family members of a Deputy Secretary of Defense, individuals whose capture would have created international incidents. George had been the ground commander, coordinating extraction under direct fire, making decisions that saved 14 lives while taking shrapnel that permanently damaged his leg. The operation had earned him the Silver Star through classified channels. He declined public ceremony, refused media attention, kept the mission sealed to protect intelligence methods and future operations. His name appeared in secure databases as a key operative in a mission considered critical to national security interests. The revelation forced partial declassification through judicial review. Suddenly, the veteran detained in a parking lot wasn't just an aging soldier, but a covert operator who'd saved lives connected to the highest levels of government. The same federal system that had questioned his citizenship had relied on his courage and silence for classified objectives. The hypocrisy became undeniable. Documents showed George had undergone extensive security clearances, background investigations, continuous monitoring throughout his contract work. The government had verified his citizenship, loyalty, and reliability dozens of times across decades. Yet an anonymous phone call based on his appearance had overridden all institutional knowledge, reducing him to suspect status in minutes. Kiana filed the lawsuit in federal court, naming the Department of Homeland Security, the two detaining agents, their supervisor, and the HSI field office as defendants. The charges: Fourth Amendment violations for detention without probable cause, false imprisonment, racial profiling, intentional infliction of emotional distress, denial of civil rights under color of federal authority. The complaint attached declassified mission records, medical documentation of service injuries, bystander footage, witness statements, the anonymous tip report, and expert analysis of detention procedures. Media attention exploded. Major outlets picked up the story of the classified operative detained because his war wounds made him look foreign. Veterans organizations rallied. Civil rights groups filed amicus briefs. Congressional representatives demanded HSI policy reviews. The case became a referendum on how post-9/11 enforcement powers had been weaponized against the communities they claimed to protect. George watched the public response from his Minnesota apartment, his classified service finally visible but in ways he'd spent decades avoiding. The exposure felt violating even as it served justice. His quiet sacrifice had been weaponized twice, first by bias that saw his scars as foreign, then by revelation that turned privacy into public spectacle. But Kiana reminded him that sometimes silence enabled the very systems that needed dismantling. The lawsuit moved toward trial with momentum built on irrefutable evidence and public outrage. The defendants' attorneys filed motions to dismiss that were systematically denied. Settlement offers emerged and were rejected. This case demanded public accountability, not quiet resolution. The trial date was set for the following spring, 18 months after a decorated veteran had been detained in a strip mall parking lot for looking too foreign to belong in the country he'd defended in silence. The federal courthouse in Minneapolis filled beyond capacity on the trial's opening day, overflow crowds gathering outside while news crews established positions across the street. Veterans organizations occupied entire rows, their members wearing service insignias and holding signs demanding accountability. Civil rights activists distributed information packets documenting patterns of racial profiling in federal enforcement. The atmosphere carried weight that transcended individual lawsuit. This was examination of systemic failure. George Rivers entered through a side entrance to avoid the media crush, Kiana guiding him past security checkpoints into the courtroom, where 3 months of proceedings would determine whether federal overreach carried consequences. He'd testified in classified briefings before, provided after-action reports on covert missions, but never under public scrutiny like this. The exposure still felt wrong, despite its necessity. The prosecution's opening argument established the narrative with precision. A 72-year-old decorated veteran, holder of the Silver Star for classified valor, detained based solely on anonymous bias about his appearance. A man who'd served in silence for decades, whose scars came from protecting national interests, treated as foreign threat in his own country. The evidence was overwhelming: surveillance footage, body camera recordings, witness testimony, medical records, declassified mission files, the anonymous tip report itself. George's testimony came on the third day, after expert witnesses had established detention procedures, racial profiling patterns, and Fourth Amendment standards. He took the stand in a suit that fit awkwardly on a frame, more accustomed to utility clothing, his limp visible as he crossed to the witness box, his scarred face composed under courtroom lighting. Kiana led him through his life chronologically. Growing up on Chicago's South Side during the Civil Rights Movement, watching his city burn, seeing his brother beaten by police, understanding early that his skin color determined how authority viewed him, enlisting at 18 to escape limited options, deploying to Vietnam twice, surviving combat that killed friends beside him. The years after, building a quiet life while carrying invisible wounds. Then the post-9/11 years, volunteering at 53 for contract work that led to classified operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Helmand Province extraction, coordinated under fire, 14 lives saved, including family members of high-ranking officials. Taking shrapnel that permanently damaged his leg, earning commendations he accepted privately, declining recognition to keep missions secure. Returning home with scars, visible and invisible, attending VA appointments for injuries that never fully healed. Finally, the detention. Walking out of a clinic clutching medication, approached by agents responding to anonymous bias, treated as foreign despite presenting valid identification, handcuffed in a parking lot while bystanders recorded and his service emblems went unrecognized. The humiliation of being processed like a criminal, fingerprinted and photographed, his citizenship verified in 3 minutes through databases the agents could have checked before detaining him. His voice remained steady through the testimony, military discipline maintaining composure, but his hands gripped the witness box edge tight enough that knuckles whitened. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. The same federal system questioning his belonging had relied on his sacrifice for classified objectives. He'd been trusted with national security missions, but not trusted to collect medication without proving citizenship. The declassified records were entered as evidence, each page stamped with security classifications and redactions, protecting ongoing intelligence methods. The mission summary detailed the Helmand extraction, George's role as ground commander, the decisions made under direct fire, the lives saved. Expert witnesses explained the significance operations like this prevented international incidents, protected critical assets, required judgment earned through decades of experience. George had been essential personnel, security cleared at the highest levels, continuously verified for loyalty and reliability. The defense struggled against the documentation. Their attorneys attempted to frame the detention as reasonable response to an anonymous tip, standard procedure requiring verification, no malicious intent. But surveillance footage destroyed that narrative. The agents had dismissed George's military ID, his VA card, his driver's license, all valid federal and state documentation, without conducting basic database checks that would have confirmed citizenship instantly. The anonymous tip had been prioritized over presented credentials because those credentials didn't align with the agent's biased assumptions about who looked foreign. Expert testimony on racial profiling established patterns. Anonymous tips disproportionately targeted people of color, particularly those whose appearance deviated from narrow definitions of American. Scars, limps, visible injuries, markers of service for veterans became evidence of foreignness when worn by black and brown bodies. The system enabled bias by accepting anonymous complaints without verification requirements, converting prejudice into federal action. Body camera footage played in the courtroom, audio and visual documentation of the entire encounter. George's calm assertions of citizenship, the agent's dismissive rejections, the moment his medication scattered, the handcuffs, his raw question captured on multiple recordings. How could service be so thoroughly invisible when appearance was judged so quickly? The footage left no room for interpretation. Witness testimony from bystanders reinforced the visual evidence. Veterans who'd recognized George's service emblems and tried to intervene. Civilians who'd recorded the encounter and posted it online. Medical staff from the VA clinic who confirmed his patient status and treatment for service-related injuries. Each testimony built an undeniable record of wrongful detention rooted in racial bias. The trial's climax built during closing arguments. The defense maintained their position, reasonable response, standard procedure, no intent to harm. But Kiana's closing dismantled that framework systematically. She displayed the anonymous tip beside George's service record. She played footage of the detention beside declassified mission reports. She presented his silver star beside the handcuff marks still visible on his wrists weeks later. Her final argument centered on unseen power. George Rivers had operated in shadows for decades, carrying secrets that protected lives, declining recognition to safeguard missions. His strength had been invisibility, his sacrifice, silence. But that same invisibility had enabled a system to ignore him, to treat his scars as foreign, to prioritize anonymous bias over documented service. The lawsuit wasn't just about one detention, it was about whether hidden sacrifice mattered, whether citizenship could be questioned based on appearance, whether federal authority carried consequences when weaponized against those who'd given everything. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. The verdict was unanimous on all counts. Fourth Amendment violations guilty, false imprisonment guilty, racial profiling guilty, intentional infliction of emotional distress guilty, denial of civil rights under federal authority guilty. The damages followed. $10.5 million compensatory for the violations, the detention, the emotional trauma, the humiliation of having citizenship questioned after decades of classified service. $23 million punitive to deter future abuses, to send a message that federal authority weaponized through bias carried severe financial consequences. Total award, $33.5 million. The courtroom erupted in supportive response, veterans and activists rising, the sound filling the space until the judge called for order. George sat motionless, Kiana's hand on his shoulder, the weight of vindication mixing with exhaustion. The number was staggering, but the verdict itself mattered more. Official recognition that what happened in that parking lot was wrong, illegal, rooted in bias the system had enabled. Consequences followed with unusual speed. The 2 detaining agents were terminated within a week, their supervisor demoted and reassigned. HSI implemented immediate policy reforms, mandatory database verification before any citizenship-related detention, acceptance of military IDs as valid proof, bias training for all field agents, accountability measures for anonymous tip processing. The reforms extended nationwide, the case becoming precedent for detention procedures across federal immigration enforcement. George donated $5 million of the settlement to veterans organizations focused on mental health and transition support, another $3 million to civil rights groups combating racial profiling. The remaining funds secured his family's future and established a foundation supporting veterans facing discrimination. The money restored dignity not through accumulation, but through deployment toward causes that mattered. He became an advocate despite his preference for privacy, speaking at veterans events and civil rights conferences about hidden sacrifice and visible bias. The classified mission that had remained secret for years became teaching tool. Evidence that service often occurred in silence and recognition came late, if at all. His scars, once weaponized as evidence of foreignness, became symbols of sacrifice that demanded acknowledgement rather than suspicion. The footage from that parking lot became training material for federal agencies, stark documentation of how bias could override procedure and credentials. George's case was cited in policy debates, congressional hearings, legal briefs challenging detention practices. The impact extended beyond individual vindication into systemic reform. One veteran's humiliation converted into accountability that protected others. George returned to his quiet life in Minnesota, though quiet now meant something different. The settlement ensured financial security. The reforms meant his detention might prevent similar incidents. The public recognition of his classified service meant his sacrifice was finally visible, even if that visibility came through violation he'd spent decades avoiding. On warm mornings, he still attended VA appointments, though now he carried copies of the court verdict alongside his identification, documentation that his citizenship had been questioned and affirmed through the highest legal standards. The parking lot where he'd been detained remained unchanged, but the surveillance camera that had captured everything had become witness to a larger truth, that power underestimated could become power, that demanded accountability, that truth endured even through humiliation, and that justice, when finally delivered, could reshape systems that had failed. His scars remained visible, permanent markers of classified service and recent vindication. But they no longer represented vulnerability. They were proof of sacrifice, evidence of resilience, symbols of a battle fought twice, once in foreign combat zones under secrecy, once in American courts under public scrutiny. Both battles had been won, though the victories looked nothing like he'd imagined when he first enlisted at 18 to escape limited options in a Chicago that didn't know what to do with young black men. The story concluded not with resolution but with continuation. The reforms were implemented but required vigilance to maintain. The settlement was awarded but couldn't erase the detention's trauma. The recognition was public but came at the cost of privacy he'd protected for decades. George Rivers lived with these contradictions, understanding that justice was method rather than spectacle, that accountability required constant pressure, that belonging in America still depended too often on proving what should never be questioned. But he also lived with this certainty. His hidden power, finally revealed, had dismantled assumptions and reformed systems. His silence, strategically broken, had created noise that echoed through policy and precedent. His scars, weaponized against him, had become evidence against the very bias that marked him as foreign. And his citizenship, questioned in a parking lot, had been affirmed through a $33.5 million reckoning that declared some betrayals, carried consequences that money alone couldn't measure, but justice demanded nonetheless.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it. And let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.